Greetings everybody, so today's presentation will be about the Central Park 5 case, a case study on bodily fluids. So today's presentation will start with the motive of the crime, chronology and also legal proceeding. So start off with the chronology. On the night of April 19, 1989, around 40 African American and Hispanic teenagers entered Central Park near 110th Street and 5th Avenue. Some were involved in assaults and robberies, including attacks on cyclists Michael Bigna and Antonio Diaz, and joggers David Lewis and John Laughlin, some of whom were seriously injured. The most serious attack occurred later that night when Trisha Meili, a 29-year-old investment banker, was raped and nearly beaten to death. She was found unconscious at around 1:30 a.m. on April 20. 5 boys, including Cabby Richardson, Raymond Santana, Antron McCray, Yusuf Salam, and Corey Wise, were arrested. In 1990, they were convicted despite no DNA evidence linking them to the crime. In 2002, Matias Reyes confessed and DNA testing confirmed he acted alone. The 5 were fully exonerated later that year. The motive behind the Central Park 5 case is complex. According to the police at the time, many of the teenagers entered the park that night to engage in reckless violent behavior, what they referred to as wilding. This involved random assaults and harassments of parkgoers, which escalated to more serious violence. However, the 5 accused boys had no clear motive for the rape of Trisha Meili and no physical evidence linked them to it. Their confessions were later shown to be coerced, casting doubt on whether they were ever involved in that specific attack. Next is the legal proceeding. Following the attack on April 19, 1989, 5 teenagers, including Cabby Richardson, Raymond Santana, Antron McCray, Yusuf Salam, and Corey Wise, were arrested and interrogated for hours without lawyers or parents. They eventually gave videotape confessions, which were inconsistent and didn't match the crime scene. In 1990, they were tried in 2 groups and convicted, even though DNA from the crime didn't match any of them. They were sentenced to between 5 and 15 years in prison. Then, in 2002, a man named Matias Reyes confessed to the rape. His DNA matched the evidence. The court vacated the boys' convictions and they were fully exonerated. In 2014, they received a 41 million settlement from the city for wrongful imprisonment.
We will also be discussing about what kind of evidence is found which led to the conviction of real criminal. The first one is semen, which is related to our group's topic, body fluid. Semen in this case was found in Trisha Meili's victim's body and also clothing. Findings from the DNA testing was shown that all of the DNA not matched with the 5 suspects, and 14 men were also being tested, including Meili's former boyfriend, but the results still show that the DNA was belonged to unidentified person. Semen found as evidence in this case shows relevancy to confirm whether rape has occurred, and exclusion of all 5 suspects during 1989, but they were also still being convicted, and after exoneration in 2002, which is the semen DNA was matched with Rice after he confessed. Other evidence that has led to the conviction of real criminal was due to the confession of the real criminal himself. Matias Rice in 2002 confessed to the police about he sexually assaulted Meili in 1989. He was also being able to tell details about the case to the police, such as the location, the timeline, and also the injuries specifically. And Matias Rice's DNA was matched with the DNA from the semen found in 1989. Many people has wondered the reasons for the confession after 12 years, but Matias Rice just stated that he was afraid to confess, but he felt that it was the right thing to do. Other evidence that has been found in this case, which also played major roles in the conviction, was hair, grass, dirt, and debris as physical evidence. This physical evidence was found from Richard's undershots. It was also presented as consistent with victim's pubic hair in the court. The prosecutor has also stated that there is high possibility of Richard being on top of the victim, or if not, how come the hair strands on Richard's undershots? This physical evidence led to Richardson being convicted with major charges among all of the 5 suspects. However, modern DNA testing was occurred and the hair strands was not coming from the victim's hair. This newspaper newspaper article was from 1990. It's about how physical evidence persuaded jurors to convict Richardson for major charges among all 5 suspects in this case.
Hello everyone, in this part of our presentation, I will be explaining the forensic technique used in the investigation of this case, especially on how they analyze bodily fluids like semen and hair. In the initial investigation in 1989, the first technique used was RFLP DNA analysis, which stands for Restriction Fragment Length Polymorphism. This was one of the earliest DNA testing methods available at the time, and it required a large and high-quality DNA sample. It works by cutting DNA into fragments using restriction enzymes and separating them by size using gel electrophoresis. However, this technique has some limitations, where it cannot detect very small or degraded samples, and the results were slow and sometimes inconclusive. Investigators used RFLP to analyze the semen sample found on the victim's body, and surprisingly, it did not match any of the 5 teenagers. However, this critical finding was largely ignored in court. The second technique used in the initial investigation was microscopic hair comparison. Hair from the scene was visually compared to the suspect's hair under a microscope, where the color, thickness, medulla, and texture of the hair were observed and compared. Experts said the hairs were consistent to some of the boys, but this technique is not reliable. This technique only offers visual comparisons, not scientifically conclusive. Despite the lack of DNA matches, the prosecution proceeded with the case, and the 5 boys were convicted, largely due to their false confession and the hair comparison, which misled the jury. Years later, in 2002, the case was reopened as Matthias Reyes, a serial rapist, confessed to acting alone in the act. He provided details that were not publicly known, raising serious doubt about the original convictions. By then, forensic science had improved, and a more advanced technique called STR DNA profiling was used. STR stands for short tandem repeat, and it's highly sensitive and widely used DNA test today. This method examines specific repeating regions in DNA, and it works with small, degraded samples, which was perfect for cold cases. STR testing was used on the semen samples again, and this time the results were clear. The DNA only matched Matthias Reyes and excluded the 5 accused teenagers. Another technique used in the investigations of this case is mitochondrial DNA analysis. This method is helpful for testing hair samples, especially when there are no roots. This means no nuclear DNA. This test looks at mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down from the mother. When they retested the hair found on the victim, the result confirmed that the hair did not belong to any of the 5 boys. Instead, one hair matched Matthias Reyes. So, in summary, we can see how these techniques played a very different roles. Older methods like RFLP and hair comparison were either weak or misleading, but the new methods like STR and mitochondrial DNA testing helped uncover the truth. These DNA techniques were essential for identifying the real perpetrator and for proving that the Central Park 5 were completely innocent. The convictions were vacated in 2002, and the 5 were fully exonerated after spending between 6 to 13 years in prison. Years spent behind bars for a crime that they didn't commit. This case is a powerful example on how the science of bodily fluids can not only convict someone, but also correct past mistakes and free the innocent.
What happened when science is ignored in a criminal investigation?
In the Central Park jogger case, the answer led to the wrongful conviction of 5 teenagers, despite bodily fluids evidence saying otherwise. In this sexual assault case, semen was recovered from the victim's body and her clothing, critical biological evidence. DNA testing was available at the time, and the result clearly showed that the genetic material did not match any of the 5 accused.
However, investigators and prosecutors rely on coerced confession instead of the forensic evidence, showing a clear failure to understand or prioritize the value of bodily fluids and DNA in forensic science.
DNA from bodily fluids is one of the most reliable identifier in forensic science. It is unique to each person, unlike eyewitness accounts or verbal confessions, which can be influenced or manipulated.
DNA testing can either confirm a suspect's guilt or, as in this case, protect the innocent. It should always guide investigation, not be ignored when inconvenient.
Years later, DNA testing finally did what the justice system failed to do: identify the real perpetrator, Matthias Rees. His DNA was a perfect match to the semen recovered in 1989.
By this case, highlight how bodily fluids evidence and DNA testing are not just tools, they are safeguards of justice. When properly used, they protect lives, ensure truth, and prevent wrongful convictions.